Good evening. Welcome to Periodic Tables. Thank you for braving the blue skies and the moderate temperatures. My name's Misha Angrist. I'm from the Duke Initiative for Science and Society. We're very excited about tonight's program. We're also very biased because you're going to hear from my colleague Alison Burke. But first I'm going to tell you about next month, which is also going to feature a Duke scholar, Alex Pfaff, who's an economist and a public policy guy, and also works in the Nicholas School for the Environment. And the title of his talk is Under Pressure, Environmental Policy in Perilous Times. He is going to discuss the findings of a recent international panel and the report that they helped write about what's going on with Earth's biodiversity and global ecosystem. And if you're asking, is he talking about the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, aka IPBES? The answer is yes. Such a sexy title. Okay. So that is going to be on Tuesday, November 19th. So please come out for that. So tonight's speaker is Alison Burke. And she is a senior director of strategy at LexisNexis. She's a research engineer at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, where she was previously executive director of the Stanford Cyber Initiative. She studies the secure integration of cyber technologies and biotechnologies into science, society, and policy. She has chaired the Blockchain Protocol and Security Engineering Conference and writes on biosecurity and healthcare-focused cybersecurity. She received her Ph.D. in bioengineering from UC Berkeley and previously worked in biomedical and technology-focused consulting with McKinsey and Company. She also teaches in the Freshman Focus program with me at Duke. She teaches a course on science, law, and policy, and we have many of our students here tonight who made it despite their bus getting stuck in the mud. So there's probably a metaphor there somewhere. And Allison has also co-authored a report on securing American elections, prescriptions for enhancing the integrity and independence of the 2020 US presidential election and beyond. And so she will discuss that and other things. Alison Burke.
Thank you. And thanks for coming out to hear about elections from somebody from California. I understand, candidates don't even campaign in California, right? We're such a complete lock that they don't even bother to travel there. Whereas half of your friends and neighbors were very excited about the outcome of the election, and half of them, like all of us in California, were like weeping and wailing and gnashing our teeth and rending our garments. So what I want to talk to you about is a white paper that we wrote at the Cyber Policy Center in Stanford and debuted in June, and it's called Securing American Elections. You can download it at cyber.stanford.edu. And so I'm going to be talking about that kind of from my Stanford hat and my Duke hat. I guess not so much my LexisNexis hat, although unless any of you are lawyers, you haven't heard of LexisNexis anyway. So the Cyber Policy Center was established by the Hewlett Foundation way back in 2015, and I helped to build it up and then decided that I wanted to do more research. And one of the things that we focused on, because for a while our faculty co-director was Mike McFaul, the former US ambassador to Russia, one of the things that we focused on was cybersecurity for elections. So not only how can we secure election infrastructure and voting machines and the voter rolls and the electronic databases that help you tell who can vote and when and where, but also how do we help secure social media platforms' treatment of foreign ads, foreign interference, kind of troll networks and bot armies and all of that. So the reason why we wanted to do that and why I'm talking to all of you about this today is in 2016, there was an attack on our sovereignty by Russia. And maybe people disagree with that. I think this is huge. I think this is very important that we should still be talking about this. And we are, luckily, still talking about this. So what I'm going to walk you through is kind of the historical motivation for why did Russia do this, who exactly was responsible for this, what happened, what was the effect of social media and of electronic voting systems, and then what can we do moving forward. So one of the reasons why we at the Cyber Policy Center wanted to write this report is that previously when there have been attacks on US sovereignty, like attacks on US soil, there are commissions that are immediately spun up to investigate what happened, why, what can we do going forward, what are the financial implications. There's something like the 9/11 Commission report or the Roberts Commission after the attacks on Pearl Harbor to determine what had happened. And we didn't really have that for the attack on our voting integrity. There was a special counsel investigation with Bob Mueller, and they were assigned, though, a specific task. It wasn't really a comprehensive mandate to look at everything that had gone on in this campaign against the election. They didn't look at what the Obama administration did and didn't do. They didn't really mention conventional and broadcast and print media. It was focused solely on online and social media effects. And even on the business side, there was not a lot in the Mueller report on financial ties between Russia and supporters and members of the administration, and there weren't any policy prescriptions, most importantly. So what we wanted to do was look at what happened and then what are policy recommendations we can make moving forward so that something like this doesn't happen again, like next year. So first of all, to understand why that happened, what was going on, I'm going to take us back and talk about understanding Putin's intentions and actions, why he would want to do this in the first place, kind of where he comes from, what are his attitudes, and why he would want kind of Russia to attack the US. And I will say that my PhD was not in Russian studies. A lot of my knowledge from this I have stolen or absorbed from Mike McFall, who, if you follow on Twitter, is always on Twitter and loves to talk about Russia. And so I learned a lot from him and took some of this kind of information from him. But there are kind of three factors we're going to look at. Defining Putinism. So what is kind of Putin's worldview? What does he want Russia to do? And what does he see as like the lasting impact of his political strategy and motivation? And then what specifically were his preferences in 2016? What kind of formulated those preferences? And what went into this multi-pronged Russian intervention that we saw affect the election? So first of all, Putin's education, what we know about him, he comes from this background of a very state-focused, proto-KGB kind of ideology, and his attitudes toward democracy are fairly negative, kind of formulated by his work with Boris Yeltsin, and focused on constraining independent sources of political power. And one of the reasons why we know this is because the interference in the US election was not Putin's first orchestrated election interference. He interfered in 2014 Ukrainian elections, 2015 in Syria, and then finally 2016 in the US. So there's kind of a pattern of ramping up how he would use different sources of media to interfere in the political process in countries that he felt disagreed with him. So his attitudes toward democracy can be characterized by an opposition to independent media, an opposition to political opposition, kind of trying to jail his political opponents, and trying to limit the spread and access and work of NGOs in Russia. So all of this contributes to some weakening checks on Kremlin's power, eliminating national independent media, reining in regional leaders, reconfiguring the party system, weakening the Federation Council, turning the Duma, their kind of parliament, into like a rubber stamp process, having elections that were neither free nor fair, constraining civil society, and cracking down on protesters. And part of this, you could say, was just to aggregate power to himself and to his political advocates and political cronies. And part of it is also, though, because of his view on the importance of the kind of the opposition of Russia to this global hegemonic elite chaired, kind of run by the US. So first of all, in terms of his attitudes toward democracy, we can look at his attitudes toward markets. And in the early years, when he was first elected, he was kind of what you might call like a Hoover Republican. So he supported a flat tax, cut corporate taxes, encouraged foreign investment, controlled inflation. But we see that he had evolving attitudes on market reforms. And from this early year attitude where he may have been more open to foreign investment and to expansionary monetary policy, his foreign policy views evolved to focus more on nationalism, redistribution of property rights to people loyal to him and his party, increased military spending, less enthusiasm for foreign investment, and kind of a shift toward more economically populist attitudes. This contributes to two kind of frameworks that form his attitude toward the West. One is an analytic framework that was formed by his years in the KGB, and he did kind of flirt with cooperation twice, after September 11th when meeting with then President Bush, and when in 2000 he mentioned that it might be possible for Russia to join NATO. So early on, he didn't like what he called like the Bush deep state of sort of like American interests that worked with Bush, but he did like President Bush as a person, as far as we can tell. This changed, though, with a reaction to some of what he saw as aggressive U.S. policies. So there was a series of events that to him indicated that we, the U.S., were not interested in cooperation, but instead in hegemony. So his notion of sovereignty is a big part of the way that Putin describes the world. And like I said, he sees this kind of elite group of hegemonic players of which the U.S. is central, and he sees that he, Russia, and other countries need to challenge these elites. So it's kind of a populist framing, but on a national scale. And this started with the expansion of NATO and bringing in countries from the former Soviet bloc, the bombing of Serbia, the invasion of Iraq, and then U.S. support for revolutions in the area in 2003 and 2004 that he really saw as kind of the U.S. and allied countries trying to assert this like global hegemonic control over what was going on in Russia and in the former Soviet Union. So there were a series of popular uprisings that the U.S. reacted to that kind of helped formulate this view of Putin. So Egypt in 2011, Libya in 2011 when we intervened, and then President Medvedev supported the U.S.'s intervention, but Putin as prime minister did not. Syria in 2011, and then finally actually demonstrations against Putin in Russia in 2011, that same year, which seemed to him like evidence that we were like propagating and promoting regime change against him. And he wasn't completely wrong to think that, because the last time that there were so many people in the streets in Russia with large-scale protests, there was actual regime change. That was the year that the Soviet Union collapsed. And so naturally, he would be worried about this and worried about the US supporting these like large-scale public demonstrations of individual Russians against the government. And then 2 years later, in Ukraine, another regime change that Putin described as the US fomenting revolution in a country along the border with Russia against one of his allies. And this kind of cemented his view that we, the US, were the enemy of his foreign policy. So when we look at kind of mature Putinism, his worldview that informed his wanting to interfere in the elections, we see that he has a focus on sovereignty, on conservative values, nationalism, and economic populism. So we can look at some things that he has said about this at the Munich Security Conference, talking about how the United States has overstepped its national borders in every way, concerned about sovereignty in the sense that he believed that representatives of foreign states were supporting protests in Russia and trying to influence election campaign processes in Russia. He also, furthermore, thought that Hillary Clinton was sort of responsible for that, and that Hillary was signaling to the opposition to oppose his re-election as president. He also believed that there is a deep state in Western countries, which is rhetoric that you may have heard repeated more recently, but believing that this is a non-democratic organization that puts on a facade of democratic institutions, but that actually there are some key players who kind of orchestrate the US's policy proposals and policy actions. He promoted conservative values within Russia and felt that it was important to preserve national identity, rely on values and orthodoxy and traditional religions of Russia, pointing to Christianity in particular. And in terms of Russia as a civilization, one way that he departs from the kind of ethnic nationalist viewpoint that's popular in some kind of enclaves in Russia is that he does see Russia as a state that has no kind of ethnic minorities, in the sense that he wants there to be a single like Russian identity that everyone can subscribe to. It has common cultural values, but in that sense, it also includes taking in kind of people from parts of Ukraine and now maybe parts of Syria and trying to give Russian citizenship to people who are, as he considers, ethnically Russian, in a way to kind of garner support and increase Russian Russian capabilities in those areas by giving them citizenship. And kind of, I feel like we're seeing that now. I don't know if you saw that in Syria, Erdogan and Putin agreed on a joint governance of the areas of Syria that were formerly Kurdish held. And so that kind of plays into his strategy of trying to amass more people and eventually more land for Russia to increase his power in the region. So he thinks that Russia has this ideology of the future that has export potential, and that his kind of Putinism ideology can be exported to other countries, at least in Eastern Europe and potentially other countries in the West. And he uses a few different tools to export that. So one is the kind of nationalized media that is broadcast internationally, RT, formerly Russia Today. Another is a network of bots and trolls that he uses, controlled by the Internet Research Agency, or the IRA, which, like, I'm old enough that when I first was doing this research, I was like, the Irish Republican Army? No, it's the Internet Research Agency that employs all these people to control Twitter accounts and post and try and both rile up divisions within American society and also promote aspects of Putinism as an ideology. He also tries to export his ideology through meeting with individual people, individual politicians, and then on occasion exporting it by force, such as invasions in Crimea and other contested areas. So in terms of the media and Russian state channels, so RT was their kind of answer to the BBC, I guess. It has 6 different broadcast languages, garners billions of views on YouTube, $300 million annual budget. It produces both kind of straight news or information and disinformation. So this is similar to their social media strategy, where not everything that they're pushing out is some kind of party line. They'll also report on both news of the day and things that are sort of not disinformation, but meant to be sensationalist, like airplane crashes and natural disasters and things like that. Notably, RT has a big presence on YouTube, and RT says that it is the most watched English language news program on YouTube. So this was a major part of their strategy of garnering social media and internet views in order to promote the news that they're putting out on RT. They also have Sputnik, which is kind of like their answer to BuzzFeed, which is a, I guess, more youth-oriented news organization that's also state-run and state-controlled, as well as the bots and kind of fake identities sponsored by the Internet Research Agency. So the Internet Research Agency isn't technically Putin-controlled, right? It's run by an oligarch who's a friend of Putin, so we say that it is kind of, state-run, or that it's pushing a state party line, but it wouldn't technically be considered, I guess, state-controlled. It's oligarch-controlled and very state-friendly. In terms of building relationships with politicians, these are politicians from the Netherlands, Italy, UK, Marine Le Pen from France, Viktor Orban from Hungary. Part of his strategy is to try and garner close relationships and kind of sympathetic allies in countries that are about to have elections, particularly contested elections, as well as some social kind of society-based ties, where Russian houses in many countries are there to kind of foster dialogue with the local populace that supports some kind of Russian party line, financial assistance to different parties, religious organizations, and also the formulation of this kind of ideological or epistemic community. So Russia's version of Alex Jones is a guy named Alex Dugin. They're in the screen, and he appeared on InfoWars, kind of trying to set up like an ideological community. So then we can ask, what were Putin's preferences in the 2016 US presidential election? The thesis that I will propose to you, and which Putin himself actually admitted, is that everything, Putin was very much against the election of Hillary Clinton and in support of the election of Donald Trump. And this kind of makes sense. Like, if you look just at what the candidates say, like if I were Putin, it's obvious just looking at the candidate statements who I would support. So during the run-up to the election, candidate Trump promised to look into lifting sanctions on Russia and recognizing Crimea as part of Russia, which were two big kind of pillars of Putinism. Tried to change the Republican platform to eliminate support for lethal weapons in Ukraine, frequently criticized NATO. Putin does not like NATO and wants countries to withdraw from NATO. He defended Putin multiple times when people would ask him, what about human rights abuses, or what about killings sponsored by Russia? He would say, well, we have a lot of killers in the US too, maybe we shouldn't be criticizing so harshly with what's going on in Russia. And he promoted isolationism, which kind of fed into Putin's idea that he wanted to create a vacuum and have the US kind of step back from its supposedly like hegemonic control of global politics. Whereas on the other hand, candidate Clinton supported recognition of Crimea as part of Ukraine, supported strengthening NATO, mentioned that she'd had a sour relationship with Putin for a long time. As you remember, back in 2011, Putin specifically said that Clinton was trying to garner protests, like kind of trying to gin up protests against his candidacy for presidency in 2011. And candidate Clinton was an advocate of maintaining US leadership in the world. But then, of course, like Putin also said this directly. So he was at a conference in Helsinki, and when asked, did you want Trump to win? He said, yes, I did. So we don't have to speculate about it. He came out and said it, so we kind of know what his motivations were here. The way that he then accomplished those motivations involved several different prongs. So probably the most effective was publishing stolen information through WikiLeaks, through the hacks of the DNC and the DCCC, and through John Podesta's emails, kind of hacking people who were influential in Hillary Clinton's campaign. He also waged several campaigns across Russian media, RT and Sputnik, as well as on social media and physical rallies where RT would actually pay US citizens to start protests in their communities or to organize activities and kind of mini rallies where people would come and support what he considered to be divisive social issues. as well as offers of business opportunities, compromising information, and then hacking of the actual electoral infrastructure, where we see that that Russian state-sponsored hackers attacked election infrastructure and election machines in all 50 states, and as far as we know, did not change votes or didn't alter kind of poll books, but had the capability to, and were kind of mapping out where there were vulnerabilities in this system. So there are many different reasons why they would have wanted to do this. There are sort of several different steps along the voting process at which Russian interference could affect people's either ability or motivation to vote. So first of all, just knowledge of voting procedures, things like ads that say that voting is useless or that say that election day is Monday or something, that influence trust in the system. So the overall intent of the Russians has been to spin us up and pit us against each other, sow divisiveness and discord, and undermine Americans' faith in democracy, in the words of FBI Director Christopher Wray. After that step, they may want to influence the choice of candidate, for example, to support Trump versus Hillary, may want to influence how when people show up to vote, are they on the voter rolls? Do they know how to use the ballot correctly? In Illinois, which is kind of the most commonly publicized interference with voting systems, the investigation into that cyber attack showed that the Russian hackers were able to get into the poll books and were in the position to be able to change voter registrations and voter preferences, but didn't. They may want to be able to affect how votes are recorded and counted. So as you guys may know, in this county, VR systems provided software for poll books, and there was malware that was provided by the kind of parent company to these individual machines that was Russian written and Russian delivered malware. So it showed some voters as having already voted, some of which may have been user error, but they did find malware on those machines that was part of this Russian campaign. And then following that, they may want to affect how votes are tallied and reported. So many states, like we'll talk about later, only have digital recording devices with no paper trail and don't have either the voter verified paper ballot where you can make sure that the digital recording machine has recorded your vote correctly, or they don't have audits after the fact. And so this provides an opportunity to affect the voting, like the voting tallies and voting reporting procedures. So in terms of the most sort of important and effective way in which Russia affected the election outcome, in terms of publishing stolen information and doxing, as you know probably, DC Leaks and Guccifer, which was kind of an identity that was used as a fictitious single hacker in order to cover up work of a group of Russian hackers, were used to publish stolen information in third-party organizations as well, like WikiLeaks. And the Trump campaign responded very strongly and positively to these kind of strategic doxing operations, with candidate Trump both mentioning this information in several speeches and kind of asking for more and publicly saying that Russia should look for these emails and should look for more documents on Hillary. We also saw pro-Kremlin media supporting Trump. So a lot of what they did was use conventional media. So this is Russian television and Russian YouTube supported content from RT. As I said, RT claims that they're the most watched news program on YouTube, and they very explicitly supported Trump during the run-up to the election. They also did a lot in terms of supporting third-party candidates, even to the extent of hosting a third-party candidate debate on their YouTube channel, which is kind of interesting because this is a foreign country hosting a debate for a US election, which we hadn't previously seen. A lot of this also, again, was promoted through the Russia-funded Sputnik news agency, which is more active on social media than RT. They use this hashtag Crooked Hillary a lot. And one of the things that now Facebook is trying to do in order to tag state-sponsored media is they say that they will identify posts and ads that are from state-sponsored news organizations so that people can at least see who is sponsoring the news that they're viewing. It's not clear whether they're going to distinguish between something like Sputnik and RT and something like BBC or Al Jazeera, but at least they will tag that the media that you're seeing is state-sponsored. The Internet Research Agency also contributed heavily in a lot of what they did. So some of what they did was amplifying anti-Clinton and pro-Trump messaging, and some of what they did was actually organizing physical rallies and connecting with people in communities who were willing to demonstrate or paying local community organizers to host protests. And a lot of what they wanted to do was amplify racial division, anti-police groups, kind of amplify any kind of divisive social issues in order to stoke negative sentiments about, I guess, the political process in the US and about enfranchisement. There were also, as we know, several offers from Russia of business opportunities and compromising information, over 140 reported contacts between the Trump team and Russian actors during the campaign and transition periods, including 37 direct meetings. 33 high-level campaign officials and Trump advisors had or were aware of contacts between Trump and Russia. So there was a lot of communication and a lot of contact between Russian government officials and members of the Trump team and of the Trump transition team. As we know, there was compromising information that was kind of promised to Trump Jr. about Clinton as part of this meeting with Natalia Veselnitskaya about, adoption, but also about lifting sanctions on Russia in exchange for compromising information on Hillary Clinton. Business opportunities were also promised, including the Moscow Trump Tower. And there was also hacking of the US electoral infrastructure. So this includes physical infrastructure, internet-connected election-related networks, election administrators and officials and their individual accounts. And 21 states were targeted as of June when we wrote this report, and there was a recent congressional report that came out a few days ago that actually said there was evidence that all 50 states were targeted, and that election infrastructure in all 50 states was at least scanned by Russian-sponsored hackers. So how would they be able to do that? A lot of the reason why they are able to do that is that voting infrastructure is fairly diverse and also fairly old. So during a recent DEF CON conference where hackers come together to share techniques and findings, they have a voting machine hacking village where they'll have a bunch of different voting machines available for hackers to try and compromise. And every single voting machine that was available was hacked. Many of them use default passwords, outdating operating systems. They store vote tallies and voter information in insecure ways. And so despite many countries moving to online voting or to electronic voting, researchers believe that the most secure way to conduct digital voting is with the option of a paper trail and with a complete paper audit, which ensures that votes haven't been tampered with. If you've ever volunteered at a polling place, which I did last year, you'll know that the machinery is, it's not even used yearly. It's used every election cycle, so it's used about every 2 years. The people who are actually staffing the polling place do not want to use it, are not familiar with it. The machines are designed to be as simple to operate as possible, but they're also fairly old, and there are often a lot of problems with setting up the machines or with accessing vote tallies. So that contributes to a lot of kind of insecure digital behavior, as it were. One of the problems with this as well is that whereas the keeping of poll books is a statewide activity, the purchase and maintenance of voting machines is a county-wide activity. So there's very little opportunity to kind of share best practices and have a centralized security audit for this type of machinery. And so if we think about the potential attack vectors on the election system, the vendors of voting machines themselves are a great target because they influence all of these different types of devices. And over 60% of American voters cast ballots on systems owned and operated by a single vendor. So if you're looking at one point of contact in which to attack where you'll be able to reach the most voters, you might look at election machine vendors themselves. Here's a distribution of how people vote across the US, from optical scanning of paper ballots, which is recommended, to these direct recording electronic machines, which are not because they don't have a paper trail. You don't have this voter verifiable kind of paper audit so that you can see that your vote was recorded correctly. Hand-counted paper ballots, a mix of optical scan and hand-counted paper in some states that are only vote by mail. So as you can see, there's a variety. Some states do multiple types of voting with kind of electronic options. And this can be difficult to ensure that everyone's vote is counted in the same way and securely. A lot of the election-related infrastructure was from the Help America Vote Act of 2002. Right after the 2016 election, Congress approved an additional $380 million to states to improve their election infrastructure, to buy new machines, to conduct security audits, to have cybersecurity training for their employees. As of the midterm elections, they had only spent about, I think, 8% of that amount, but they were projected to spend all of the money allocated to them by the 2020 election. And this here is talking about Illinois' breach by Russian actors during the 2016 election, where they penetrated Illinois' voter registration database, viewed tables, accessed voter registration records, and were in the position to delete or change voter data, but didn't. So some of that $380 million allocation is supposed to help with this. One of the problems with this is that a lot of states would like to get support or help from some of the large tech companies that help with the cybersecurity of journalists or of you and I if we outsource our documents to Google Docs or outsource our email. But there are both laws preventing companies from providing support above a certain dollar amount, as well as laws preventing the actual party organizations from providing support to local candidates or to individual kind of state parties. Like the federal Democratic Party can't provide cybersecurity support to the state Democratic Party without it counting as a donation in kind. And so one of our policy proposals is to remove those caps specifically for cybersecurity support so that candidates and campaigns can get kind of help from as many people as possible in as many ways as possible. And some of their recommendation, it isn't necessarily very sophisticated cybersecurity recommendations that are given. It's just wanting to standardize it and wanting everyone to have the same security benchmark. So suggesting things like use the blue YubiKey as your second factor. Outsource your document sharing to Google Docs so that you're not constantly emailing attachments back and forth. Kind of pretty basic recommendations, but recommendations that, as of now, individual security researchers have to go and talk to candidates and campaigns one-on-one in order to propagate this, rather than having something like Google's security team being able to offer the same support to every candidate and campaign. So we're not the only place that has this problem. There are a lot of countries that are using electronic voting and running into similar concerns. So this is just kind of a rundown of everywhere that electronic voting has been used or has been piloted. The one, I'm not sure if it's on here, but so Estonia, Estonia was the first country to have legally binding general elections using the internet. They've been doing fairly well, but they also issue every citizen an electronic ID, and they have a very small population who are kind of very digitally well educated. And so I'm not suggesting that would work in the US, and in fact, the recommendation that I and other security researchers make is just to go back to paper ballots, to optically scan paper ballots, that we're not confronted with the issue of having multiple different voting machines in use in different states that are in different levels of security and probably use default passwords. If you want to see a video on how a voting machine can be hacked, you can go to verifiedvoting.org, which is a nonprofit, and they have this video from a researcher, a professor at University of Michigan, who goes through hacking a Diebold voting machine. As you can see from the video, the whole video is 4.5 minutes long, so hacking the machine takes about 2 minutes. You can see how easy it is there. But another thing that I want to talk about, aside from the actual infrastructure, the actual hardware of election machines that can be hacked, we also want to look at hacking of social media, hacking of kind of our internet infrastructure in terms of communicating information. So one of the things that I found sort of ridiculous after the election was when Mark Zuckerberg said that initially he thought there was no way that information shared on Facebook could have influenced the election, and he thought that foreign influence or foreign ads on Facebook would have had no effect on the election, when in fact Facebook itself was promoting that their voting stickers had influenced election turnout, and that what people literally saw on Facebook in terms of a sticker saying that they voted had promoted turnout and made people more likely to vote themselves. As we now know, there were more than 3,000 Facebook ads that were purchased by Russian interests, more than 10 million potential voters exposed to foreign interference via Facebook ads, and a lot of social media content that was shared without being read or without being fact-checked. So the responsibility of Facebook is kind of up for debate if they disallow political ads from outside the US, or if they put into place more rules about who can see political ads. They worry that they may stop smaller political groups from spreading their message. On the other hand, if we want to prevent foreign influence in our elections, a platform where 44% of American adults get their news is a good place to start. And one of our policy recommendations is to increase restrictions on foreign purchases of election ads and election-related ads on social media. So here's what some of these ads looked like. As you can see, they weren't all directly about a candidate. Some would have a picture of Trump or Hillary or have a hashtag that related to them, but some of them were just about trying to poke at social hot-button issues, like Black Lives Matter, police brutality, and trying to get people to support what they thought were legitimate kind of grassroots activist groups. One of the problems with this is that when we look at how fake news and kind of mainstream news are shared and where people see their news, the share of fake news that people see on social media is much greater than the share proportionally of mainstream news. So most mainstream news sites and links are shared either directly through that news site's website or through search, whereas proportionally more fake news is seen through social media. Researchers at Stanford did a study and found that for fake news to have changed the outcome of the election, a single fake news story would need to have a persuasion rate roughly equivalent to seeing 36 television campaign ads. But we can also assume that people may have seen more fake news on their social media feed than they saw television campaign ads. And it's possible that in scrolling through a news feed, you could see 3 different fake stories all at once, whereas you probably wouldn't sit through 3 television ads back to back. The total political ad spend, though, was not primarily on social media. Most of it was on broadcast TV. And so in terms of the effect that we can have asking platforms like Facebook to clearly identify political ads or to ban political ads that are funded by foreign actors, that still won't totally solve the problem. Like, that won't remove all of the foreign interference and all of the foreign advertising that's seen. In particular, radio and TV regulations for ads require equal time and don't require fact-checking. So a lot of the calls for social media to identify fake news or fake statements in political ads is kind of incomplete without asking the same thing of radio ads and TV ads, which don't require that. Facebook, of course, is not the only platform providing information, both textual and subtextual, about candidates. We can also look at Google's influence in terms of how they auto-complete search suggestions or how they present rankings. There have been studies that show that people tend to only look at maybe the first 3 results and tend to trust those results more. And so if they're searching for a candidate and we see that in terms of Google results by party, stories about Democrats are more likely to be favorable in the top 3 results than stories about Republicans, we could call that evidence of bias. We could ask Google to change their ranking algorithms, for example, or to try and affect how the favorability of the results that they provide is demonstrated. And we know that this hasn't just been a problem in 2016. So polling data by the American Enterprise Institute looks at the percentage of people who believe various other politically motivated conspiracy theories. And for some of these, if you add them up, like if we see that maybe 20 or so % of people believe that President Kennedy was assassinated by an extreme right-winger, and another 30 or so % believe that President Kennedy was assassinated by a communist. That's like almost 50% of people who don't believe that President Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. And so this is a problem that we're going to have to kind of deal with beyond social media. This affects mainstream media, it affects broadcast media, it affects newspapers, et cetera. So I want to do kind of a little bit of a straw poll. Do you recall seeing these headlines on social media prior to the 2016 election? And so this is not like, did you believe the headline, but just do you recall seeing it? So show of hands. A few, okay. A Republican congressman helped broker a deal for Donald Trump to buy a taxpayer-owned building in order to build the Trump International Hotel.
Are we counting newspapers?
Sure, I guess, yeah, just if you saw the headline. Okay, maybe another 1 or 2. Repeated requests for additional security in Benghazi were routinely denied. A lot, okay. Hillary Clinton said that you could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. Similarly, a lot. Clinton Foundation staff were found guilty of diverting funds to buy alcohol for expensive parties in the Caribbean. Maybe 7 or so. FBI Director James Comey was secretly communicating with Donald Trump about when to release results of the FBI investigation into Clinton's private email server. Maybe another 8 or so. Okay, so interestingly, the first headline is false. The second headline is false. The third headline is false. The fourth headline, the basket of deplorables one, that's true. The latter 2 are placebo headlines, so these were never shown on any media whatsoever before the election. So you recall seeing them, but they were never there. So this was a study that we did to show that people's recollection of what they saw is very subject to revision. So when we look at what I showed you before, the impact of a headline in order to influence a voter, that persuasion rate is highly manipulable. So when we look at the persuasion rate, we're looking at people who say that they reported seeing actual fake news stories, but if they can't even remember whether or not they saw a fake headline, the ability of that headline to persuade is called into question. So in terms of measuring the impact, can we really say that the Russian intervention changed the outcome of the election? No, and it's very hard to do this analysis after the fact. Certainly we can't say that that was the only variable. It may have played just a marginal role in influencing the outcome, but then again, the election was won in the margins. We do know that Russian interference sparked a rift between Sanders and Clinton supporters. We saw fewer Sanders supporters voting for Clinton than expected. We saw suppressed voter turnout, particularly among Democratic African Americans, and targeted efforts to discourage minorities. And we saw more support for third-party candidates than we would have expected. So if you look at just Jill Stein votes compared to the amount by which Clinton lost these states, we could see that there's potentially some impact in terms of Russian influences and Russian efforts to support third-party candidates and to get people to vote for third-party candidates instead of a Democratic candidate. Putinism itself also kind of had gains beyond the 2016 election in terms of diminishment of American leadership. Trump didn't follow through with all of his kind of campaign promises to Putin, like the US is still in NATO, we still support the Ukraine, Crimea is still considered part of the Ukraine, there were new sanctions on Russia, we've expelled some Russian diplomats. But Trump does also still defend Putin, and we do see that there's more kind of divisiveness in terms of the effect of American leadership on these treaties. We also anticipate future foreign threats that are not just Putin. So we're worried about disinformation from multiple sources. We're worried about deepfakes. Of course, we're worried about the influence of China and North Korea and any other actors who may wish to influence upcoming elections. We're worried about undermining public confidence in electoral processes in general. Worried about deepfakes and more sophisticated bot networks. The threat keeps escalating, and this is kind of a tit-for-tat game of trying to stay on top of abilities of actors to pose as fake U.S. citizens or to promote fake news through social media disinformation channels. So in terms of what we're trying to do about it, these are all the election-related pieces of legislation that have been introduced. You can see most of them are just in the introduced stage. A few have passed the Senate, a few have passed the House, and these range from a $600 million Election Assistance Commission grant to replace these direct recording electronic machines, to something like establishing a minimum period for early voting, declaring Election Day a national holiday. There are a lot of different proposed solutions to this, and the majority of these bills are not likely to pass. We can see that people are kind of just throwing darts at a board in terms of trying to solve the problem. And our report, I probably won't go through all of this because I think I'm a little bit over time, but our report has a couple of different policy prescriptions that I'll highlight some of, I think, the most important ones. Requiring risk-limited auditing for all elections is statistically validated to allow us to have a certain level of confidence in the outcome of an election. Allowing political parties to provide cybersecurity assistance to state parties, like I talked about, without that coming against the cap of the amount of funding that state parties can have. Requiring greater disclosure measures for foreign media organizations. Creating norms for the media's handling of stolen information, asking candidates to pledge not to use stolen information about their opposing candidate during the election process, strengthening the norm of not meeting with foreign governments during the transition period so that only one government represents America at a time, as well as developing guidelines about internet platform cooperation with foreign governments, and conducting strategic disruption campaigns against adversaries that seek to interfere with US elections. You may have seen that Cyber Command during the midterm elections attacked the Internet Research Agency on that day in order to bring down their network so they couldn't do anything on the actual day of the midterm elections. So we do support continuing to do that and continuing to use Cyber Command to influence the operations of attackers, state-sponsored hackers against the US. So we can talk more about the recommendations or anything that you guys have questions on. I'll point out that when you Google Bear Eagle friends, you get a lot of pictures like this where I'm not sure they are friends, but they are together. So thank you for listening to me, and I would love to have any questions or comments. Yes. Yeah, so, I don't know if Trump expected to win, I would say, because of his personality, I assume that he expects to win everything all the time. But certainly, like, Putin and Russia initially did not expect that Trump would win. They just wanted to sow discord, and so they were supporting a lot of third-party candidates, and they kind of saw Trump as this, like, fringe candidate who would be more divisive and kind of more volatile, and who also didn't have the detriments of Clinton in terms of having a previously bad relationship with Putin, and supporting NATO and supporting a lot of things that Putin didn't want to support. And then I think that as Trump gained in popularity, they realized that they could throw more support behind him and that he was becoming a viable candidate. And I think this kind of speaks to their overall strategy of not just trying to put their preferred candidate in power, but also trying to sow discord and divisiveness and trying to reduce the ability of Americans to kind of act together and reduce the overall power of the U.S. By creating more infighting and less kind of concerted action. And I think we see that in other countries where they're trying to operate as well. Like, in France, supporting Marine Le Pen, who was not expected to win, but was someone who was divisive because of her, like, ethnic attitudes, like her racial attitudes toward the population of France. So I think that's an overall strategy of trying to support the divisive candidate, whoever that is. Yes?
Curious, the difference between tampering with the machine, which is terrifying, it seems to be clearly like, in quotes, a crime or a problem, versus putting bullshit on Facebook or in the social media stuff. That seems like not subverting the system. That is democracy. I mean, every candidate puts bullshit on Facebook. My children put it on. That to me doesn't seem as problematic. And I wonder when we conflate those two things, when tampering with the boxes is clearly intended to, like, that's not within the rules. But putting nonsense on social media, that's how it's, and we do. I mean, the U.S. does it everywhere we've ever been.
Yeah, so you're right. Like, tampering with the machine is definitely a crime, kind of no matter who does it and for whatever reason that they do it. And then the portion of Facebook activity that falls under, what would be considered a crime is that we do have laws against foreign-sponsored advertising in the election in general. Like, foreign governments aren't allowed to buy, like, TV ads for particular candidates. And so applying,
Matter of sourcing where the dollars come from.
for the most part, yeah, like,
Dollars came from Europe or Africa or South America or Russia, we can't take the ad.
right, yeah,
It has nothing to do with the content.
right.
Purely where the check comes from.
Yeah, yeah. So right, so that's the portion of Facebook activity that we want to prohibit, but you're right, like, anyone can put whatever,
My children put it crazy.
yeah, anyone can put their opinion onto Facebook, and that's not illegal. What they're trying to crack down on is, like, RT buying ads on Facebook, where they're a government-sponsored media organization trying to buy an election-related ad within, like, a set period of time before an election. That's the part that's illegal. Yes.
Since digital voting seems to be such a problem, why did we go there in the first place instead of staying with paper ballots? What are some of the advantages? And then, in a blue sky, sort of ideal world, what would be a way to make it work if we really wanted to push in that direction? What are some of the solutions, high-tech solutions, where if we had budgets to do it? What would
Yeah, so in terms of some of the reasons why we moved toward digital voting, like, there were accessibility concerns where some of these machines can, like, read a ballot to you or can provide other ways for people to vote in a more accessible way than a paper ballot, where maybe someone would have to, like, come and help a disabled person vote. And there's also a concern of allowing, like, service members who are deployed to vote without having to mail in absentee ballots way ahead of time. So there are, like, populations of voters that are overseas who could be helped by digital voting. I guess in terms of how we want to do it going forward, like, there are even smaller, like, there are counties and jurisdictions that have experimented with, like, blockchain-enabled voting, with other, many different forms of digital voting. But right now, because it's not, I mean, like, I guess kind of what I want to suggest is that although elections are currently the domain of the states, if we had some kind of federal oversight of elections, I feel like that would be the best way to deploy a digital voting solution where we could have tests run, we could have kind of like red teaming of this system, we could at least make sure that everyone is seeing the same digital voting experience, and that because there are so many users, we can see that the system is scalable and is responding to the kind of level of demand and of use that it would have on election day, which I know is like politically unpopular and kind of like a personal view that we should have like federally run elections. But yeah, I mean, all of the voting security experts that I've seen are just saying stick with paper ballots. Like we're not ready until we kind of solve the problem of cybersecurity in other industries that deal with this every single day. Something like voting, where we only deal with it like once every 2 years. That we're not ready to have a digital system yet. Yes.
Do you happen to know if there have been any studies that compare the kind of things that happened in the United States in this last election, the kind of things that the United States might have done in the past to other countries, that we might be able to ask questions whether people have actually learned from our own behavior?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know specific studies, but certainly, like, yes, like, we have definitely interfered in the political processes of other countries, like, particularly in South America, and, like, our hands are not clean. We haven't, to my knowledge, done so in the same way. Like, we haven't done so via social media, but...
And so there's an opportunity to do some kind of study that compare this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes.
It seems like we might have the same kind of problem with the census being taken next year. Do you know of anyone that's taking a look like you've done great work at potential for contaminating, changing the census data?
Yeah, so I guess two of my colleagues at Stanford, Nate Pursley and as well as Mike McFall also are studying that and other kinds of voting processes as a whole. And I'm trying to remember, there's one other, his last name is Kumar, but I'll get back to you with that guy's name. But yeah, there are a couple of researchers that I know of looking into that. Yes.
So to ask the big question, I think it's on a lot of people's minds. Do you think that we have successfully adapted from what we learned from the 2016 election, and would be successful in stopping Russian interference in the 2020 election? That's, I think, hypothetically.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So you're saying, have we successfully learned from what happened in the 2016 election, and are we going to be able to stop this kind of interference in 2020? I mean, certainly social media has cottoned on to the problem, and Facebook is actively banning networks of disinformation accounts, like networks of bot accounts. Twitter is too. Like, in terms of whether we are going to be able to preempt any kind of interference, like, I don't think so, and I know that, Russia continues to try to do this. I may ask, I guess, the two of you who are from Facebook and UNC respectively, like, do you feel like we have solved the problem?
Not necessarily solve the problem, but I think all the social media companies have learned lessons, various lessons from 2016. So, like, I would point to the ads transparency databases that all the companies have, or the big companies have rolled out, so that citizens, journalists, and other actors can see all the political ads that are being blocked, and that adds a level of transparency in the system. The other big thing is the verification requirements. So Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Google, et cetera, all now have explicit verification processes, so that you have to be in the U.S. In order to run ads. So that takes care of some of the foreign interference sort of issues. And then I would just point to exactly what you said, better monitoring around security efforts, around coordinated attacks more broadly.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm Matt. I'm formerly a currently at Facebook. I joined Duke about 10 days ago. Joined the Science and Society Initiative, so I'm your colleague.
Come to the light.
So, and I'm directing the Duke Center on Science and Technology Policy, so if any of you are interested, that could be a part of it. I think it's good things for the community and looking at science and technology policy issues. I would say Facebook has gotten a lot better, as have other social media platforms, as Daniel said. But I think it's basically impossible to solve this issue. It's an arms race, so you have security teams at companies like Facebook trying to improve their security practices.
Yeah, Vanilla. Oh, we'll do two more because I picked one of my students who has a great question.
So do you think that as Putin starts to explicitly like go Trump towards like Trump and basically like get Trump elected, Trump already had like pro-Russia sentiments, or Trump recognizing that Putin's like potentially support and develop pro-Russia sentiments to like sort of court that like support monetary other support?
Yeah, I mean, Trump had already had like Russian business dealings prior to this, as well as Ukrainian business dealings. So I feel like it was kind of like a symbiotic relationship in terms of like he already had investment in Russia and had business partners in Russia, and then as he saw that they were supporting his candidacy, became more favorable toward Russia as well. Yes.
How would you say domestic disinformation campaigns compare to foreign disinformation campaigns?
Yeah, so there hasn't been a lot of research studying that, how domestic disinformation campaigns compare to foreign disinformation campaigns. Yeah, in a sense, it's harder to study because we don't have those same like prohibitions against spend, on ads that explicitly endorse a candidate or something. Another difficulty, I guess, is that a lot of foreign disinformation tries to cloak itself as domestic actors. So it's a little bit difficult to tease out. But yeah, I would love to see more research on that, particularly in terms of economically how much is spent on that and how we would classify disinformation in that case. Like, I guess if you look at, like the conspiracy theory slide that I put up, like a lot of those I'm sure are promoted by domestic, like by citizens as well, and whether we consider that disinformation or just like a fringe political view is hard to denote. And one of our policy proposals is to allow the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission, to determine what should or shouldn't be considered political advertising and kind of describe categories for what should be an issue ad for each election, because it'll vary. So yeah, I guess I'm hoping to see more research on that.
Okay, last question.
Okay, yes.
This is a question around voter rolls, and my sense from reading the newspaper and all is that right now the state election boards or commissions are doing, in some places, a rather snazzy job of taking people off the voter rolls who really should not be taken off. And I don't know how many that obviously can play into, and I don't know how Russians or other actors can influence that going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's some concern, like in Illinois, that they may have been able to hack voter rolls and we're in the position to be able to delete people from voter rolls. And there's also, concern that people are being removed from voter rolls either through bugs in software, or just like faulty automated disenrolling of people who are considered like active voters, or marking people to have moved when they haven't, as well as the potential, I guess, that people are going in and removing people like kind of by hand maliciously. So there are kind of multiple different angles in which that could happen, some of which are hacking related and some aren't. But people report, going and seeing whether they're registered and knowing that they have registered and seeing that they have been removed. So basically, check early and often that you are registered. And in some cases, it's hard to tell whether that's because of faulty software, or because of hacking, or because of malware being introduced that makes it look like there's faulty software. But yeah, it's something that's happening.
So another hand for Alison Burke. Thanks so much. I know our students have a bus to catch. Hopefully it won't get stuck in the mud. We will see you next month with Alex Pfaff, Tuesday, November 19th. Thanks again for coming out.